Hello, and thank you for joining us today for another episode in our podcast series, The Continuing Evolution and History of RxP. In this series, we explore the events and interview the pioneers that shaped the movement from its very beginnings in the 1980s to today. In this episode, I am very excited to have a discussion about the first psychopharmacology training program for psychologists outside of the military. The very first psychopharm training program for psychologists was delivered through the Department of Defense and was limited to psychologists in the military. Unfortunately, it was discontinued after graduating only 2 cohorts. We will have a separate episode devoted to this psychopharmacology demonstration project and its graduate. Since the DoD program was limited to military personnel, it became necessary to develop similar training programs for non-enlisted psychologists. This is when the Prescribing Psychologist register started in the mid-1990s. Personally, I have a very close connection to this program since I was one of its graduates. PPR was followed by the RxP certificate training program at the Center Through the Looking Glass, and for a time the two existed simultaneously. We will explore both of these programs in this interview. My guests today are Dr. Elaine LeVine and Dr. Stephen Berger, who had deep involvement in both of these programs. So let me first start with Dr. LeVine. Dr. Elaine LeVine is a prescribing psychologist specializing in adult therapy in Las Cruces, New Mexico. Dr. LeVine and Dr. Marquez were the first prescribing psychologists in New Mexico. My understanding is that their licenses were actually dated on the same date. The conditional prescribing certificate, Dr. Maria Marquez had number 1, and for the actual prescribing certificate, Dr. Elaine LeVine was numbered 1. Dr. LeVine began her RxP training at the Prescribing Psychologist Register and then started a professional development certificate program for psychologists through her Center Through the Looking Glass in affiliation with the New Mexico State University at Las Cruces. This program trained the first group of prescribing psychologists in New Mexico. She has been a tenured professor and adjunct faculty member at New Mexico State University and has maintained a private practice for over 40 years. Dr. LeVine has published 3 scholarly books and numerous journal articles on various aspects of human development, psychotherapy, and psychopharmacology. Her text in Child Psychotherapy, Listen to the Children, was published in 3 editions. Evelyn's Golden Leaf is her first publication written for children with the goals of enhancing personal growth. Welcome, Dr. LeVine.
Thank you.
And my second guest today is Dr. Stephen Berger. Dr. Berger receives his PhD from the University of Miami. He received his psychology license in 1972 and the ABPP diploma in clinical psychology in 1984. He was a consulting psychologist for the Los Angeles County Occupational Health Service, and he has taught for the University of Southern California, the California School of Professional Psychology, which is now at Alliant International University, and is a full professor at the Chicago School, the campus located in Anaheim, California. He has delivered over 200 invited addresses and presentations at regional, national, and international psychology associations. He treats the entire age range. He has awards from the Orange County Psychological Association, the California Psychological Association, and APA's Association for the Advancement of, I think, was psychopharmacology, right? Was it Division 55?
No, that was specifically from our, at the time, Political Action Committee, headed by Rogers Wright.
Oh, okay. He has been an expert witness in criminal, personal injury, and malpractice and psychology board complaint cases. He was a plaintiff in the CAPP versus Rank case protecting independent hospital practice rights for clinical psychologists. He received his initial psychopharmacology training through the Prescribing Psychologist Register and continues to be involved in the prescription privileges movement. Dr. Berger, thank you for joining us.
Very happy to be here.
So, Steve, let me start with you. What was your path towards psychopharmacology?
Well, my path really begins with the CAPP versus rank case. And that's how I got involved in significant ways with professional psychology. It started with the organization CAPP, California Association of Psychology Providers. It was an organization created specifically to defend the hospital practice rights of clinical psychologists in California, which those rights appear in the law in section 1316.5 of the Health and Safety Code, not in our license. It's in the laws regulating hospitals. And in the laws regulating hospitals is where we got our hospital privilege rights. And so those had to be protected because Department of Health Services made some regulations that restricted our rights and conflicted with the statute. When that case was won at the California Supreme Court, there was a midnight session of the legislature where psychiatry tried to slip a amendment into a bill that would have negated the law, the statute, and the Supreme Court victory. And as a result, a special committee was formed within California Psychological Association, and I was part of a advisory task force with people such as Chuck Faltz and Lou Carpenter, which were the stalwarts of professional psychology in California. And as a group, we recommended that CPA endorse prescription privileges. And so that's how I really became involved with that movement. Subsequently, APA provided some funds along with services in kind from Alliant, CSPP.
ESPP, right?
Yes, blocking all my letters. And so it was a special panel to come up with the guidelines for what training clinical psychologists should get to be competent to prescribe. And so there was a task force meeting. It was run by Ron Fox, and Ron eventually became president of APA. So as a result of all that kind of involvement, when I got an email from Sam Feldman, it was clearly a mass emailing asking people to join the Prescribing Psychologist Register for $10. And I wrote, here's my $10. Don't know if you're a fraud or if you're for real, but for $10, I'll take a chance that you're for real. Sam told me later that I wrote the most positive endorsement and supportive. I'm telling you, that's what the email said. In addition, I said, and so here are the names of people at APA that if you want to pursue this movement, that I recommend that you contact. Because Sam perceived me as being so supportive when he came out to California doing his first training session. And I was there, met him personally, and he found me to be somebody that he thought would be helpful to be more involved. And that led to me being his right-hand man for quite a while.
Elaine, what was your path towards your interest in RxP? How did your interest in psychopharmacology as a field develop?
Well, I had sprung from the university as an academic, though I'd had a part-time private practice. I was in full-time practice and really enjoying it. And as I'm sure you gentlemen remember, in the late 90s, managed care came in and became incredibly powerful. At the same time, Prozac emerged and a lot of the atypical antipsychotics. And everything was going fine, and all of a sudden, it felt like that. I started hearing from these managed care companies, we don't need your help. This person is psychotic, and we're just going to put them on atypical antipsychotics. They don't need therapy. Or this person is bipolar. You obviously can't help them. They just need an atypical. and similarly with other medications. And of course, that was very alarming to me. And I thought, I don't know about this. I better find out about it. And so I think actually there was a big spread in one of the monitors, the APA monitor, about Sam starting some coursework. I guess that was after you were already involved with it, Steve. I don't know. But I jumped on it thinking I want to learn why they're not letting me see my patients anymore. And I quickly became convinced that the services we had in that area, the psychiatric services, were not up to snuff. They were not what I was learning about. And I also felt that we could do this, you know? It rather quickly occurred to me that, well, I think I could do better than what my patients are getting when they're only seeing this person once every 2 or 3 months, and they're not getting all these lab tests that are being recommended. So that was my start.
Fascinating. And it kind of parallels my start a little bit because I became interested in psychopharmacology as a field in the early 90s, just like you mentioned, Elaine, started to see more and more patients on psychotropic medications. Managed healthcare started to push people more towards psychiatric services than psychological services. So that kind of started an interest for me saying, what are these meds all about? What do they do? How do they work? Right. And then really, as I was just becoming interested in psychopharmacology as a field, I received an email from Sam, and that was really pretty early on. This was either late 94, maybe early 95, essentially saying, so I'm starting this training because, we believe that psychologists with an additional training can become competent in this field and start to prescribe medications. We kind of feel like this is the next step, significant movement for psychologists. Would you like to be a part of it? And I said, sure, I'd love to, not knowing where it would go. I knew that at the very least, I would get some really good training in this field. So I signed up almost immediately. I believe I was the first psychologist from New Jersey, which is where I was based at the time, who signed up. And of course, we started classes, I think, there was some online training that he had pre-recorded, and I believe that was the beginning of it. And then I think the classes started in 1996, and that's where I met both of you when we started to do the in-person classes.
I was just going to say, when I was thinking about doing this, isn't it ironic that at that time, the managed care was trying to push us out because the psychotropics were so much cheaper
Right.
than psychotherapy.
That's right.
And look how that's turned around, you
Right.
know?
And I think it was the cost of medications, one, but also the psychiatric practice patterns of psychiatrists, right? Being able to see 6 people an hour, if not more,
That's true.
seeing people once every 3 months, maybe once every 6 months for refills. So certainly the overall cost from the managed care perspective was a lot lower to go that route. And we know where that led, right? I mean, by comparison to many other countries in the world, our rates of medicating our population are a lot higher, and especially among kids. Our rates are as much as 5 times higher than some of the European countries. And that's, I think, partly because we tend to rely so heavily on these kinds of treatments. So let's talk a little bit about the format of the training. First of all, does anybody know how Sam Feldman, so Dr. Samuel Feldman was a psychologist based in Florida.
Right.
And he was the one who started the prescribing psychologists registered training program. Does anybody know how Sam became interested in it?
No, I don't recall a discussion with him other than it was clear to him that this was a possible business to do the training. And so PPR was always his private business. And that became a bit of a problem because to some degree, people perceived it as an organization. And on the letterhead was this long list of board of directors, which I was listed as a member of the board. But I can tell you that almost none of those people had any influence in anything. But what was critical and really problematic was that Sam accurately viewed it as his business. And in the early days, because of my connections with CPA as well as with CSPP, that I tried to get him connected so that he would be able to not just be a freestanding operation educationally, but be connected with either the state association or with the professional school. And we were at dinner one evening, and it was just clear that these two could not merge because he was unwilling to turn over any aspect of the operation to the school. And that remained a kind of problem over the years.
And we'll kind of get back to that because that's partly why a need developed for the next program that was Elaine's program, right? So we'll get into that history in a little bit. Speaking of PPR still for the moment, we have to acknowledge that the faculty in the program was absolutely stellar. I mean, we had Dr. John Preston, who was a well-known figure in psychopharmacology at that time, already had written a number of books. Some of them became really the standards in the field. We had faculty from various professions. We had several psychiatrists who were on faculty. We had Dr. Victor de la Cancela, who was a specialist in a field that was not yet widely known back then, and that's ethno-psychopharmacology, and delivered some highly specialized and advanced training in that field. You folks remember any of the other faculty?
Arnold Lazarus's son, Cliff.
That's right, Clifford Lazarus. That's right. I do remember him very well. Yes. Yeah, so the quality of the classes was absolutely stellar, and the format of the training, for those I'm not familiar with it, was that I believe
Another name, David Goldman, who was a psychiatrist
that was
and
one
an
of the
attorney.
psychiatrists.
Right.
And he had one of my favorite lines. He would say, "And when it's all been said and done, I'm still saying it and doing it." Just love that from him. A little show and tell, going back to John Preston. I don't know if you all
Yes,
will recognize
of course.
this. I carry that in my appointment book right next to the ethics code
Mm-hmm.
and the evidence code in California.
And Dr. John Preston started that. That's actually over the years, someone who became a close colleague of his was Dr. Brett Moore. So he actually continues that, and I believe the latest edition of this just was distributed a few months ago. So it's still on my desk today.
I don't leave home without it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I distribute it to my students and encourage them to use it widely. So we mentioned a little bit about the faculty. So the format of the classes was kind of interesting because it was all in-person training, with the exception of that initial one, which was by video. All the subsequent classes were in person. I recall the meetings would alternate between East Coast and West Coast, with an occasional one scheduled in Florida or elsewhere, but most of them occurred either in New York or in California about every other month. These were long weekends, very intensive weekends. The classes ran from 8 a.m. until 6 p.m. both days, with 1 hour lunch break. There was an examination at the end of every one of the weekends, very detailed and very, in-depth examination. The curriculum, and maybe this is a good time to talk about some of the curriculum. So the curriculum really was developed by Sam in consultation with the faculty at the time when APA did not yet have training guidelines, because the PPR program started before APA started to develop and publish their training guidelines. Go ahead, Elaine.
If I could add on to that, as I recall now, the initial training was 6 sessions. And then
7 sessions.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yep.
7 sessions. And then when the APA came out with their recommendations, and I looked that up, that was 2009 when at the first time they, came out with the recommended training, which was longer. Then he decided to add on more coursework.
So what happened was APA started to publish these in the late 90s. And the first version of the length of time to deliver this training was such that 7 of his weekends met that. Very shortly afterwards, APA increased it to 300 hours, which was in the early 2000s. So Sam extended his classes and started to add additional classes. So now we can meet the 300 hours. Well, the story continues, because while we were meeting, and I believe we were close to meeting the 300 hours, that APA revised it once again, and that's what you're referring to, is they finally settled on 450 hours. So Sam again had to organize more classes so that his training met the 450 hours that became, part of the APA training guidelines. So this program really evolved and revised as APA was developing the model of how to train psychologists to become prescribers.
I think if I may not be accurate about this, but my recollection was the 300. And then when our law went forward and we got pushed to the 450, then he added that again, to be consistent.
Yeah, that was the sequence. So the first iteration was 120 hours, and that, if you divide the 18-hour seminars, you get 6.67. I just did it on my calculator, and that's why it had to be 7 full sessions. Slight tangent. The very first in-person was a Friday night, Saturday, and part of Sunday. That turned out to clearly not be good, to be trying to get people available on Friday night. And that's why it became full day Saturday and full day Sunday. And I was responsible for taking the attendance and the methodology for that, because in California, all of his seminars qualified for continuing ed for the Board of Psychology. And that made very strict rules about attendance and how attendance was to be kept. And that's another whole story about the continuing ed requirement as it came into California, who was involved with that. The Board of Psychology did not want to administer that. And so CPA got a contract with the board to do that administration. That's a whole separate story. Going from the 120 to the 300 came out of that task force that APA sponsored and paid half of the cost of. And I don't know how much you want me to go into what occurred at that meeting. But
that would be great. Some of that history is wonderful to have, because it's not really recorded anywhere.
Well, again, usually some of this would have cost you a drink, but okay. I'll supply my own soda. And there's no rum in it. There had been published several proposed programs for training clinical psychologists to do prescribing. and they averaged around 450 hours, each of those published ones. And so one of the purposes of this special task force with professionals from a variety of professions was that if they would come together, they could come up with a number less than 450. I'm sorry that I left my paperwork at the university, because then I could hold you my yellowed piece of paper with my notes from the meeting. Because when the first session was over, guess what the total came to? 450. They said, wait a minute, we came here specifically to not get 450. The neurologist on the panel stood up and said, I could train psychologists in 12 hours to be able to prescribe safely. So they created a separate subcommittee to come up with something fewer than the 450. And what they came up with was the 300 number. That's how that came about. And then Elaine, yes, your state gave us the 450.
Right, right. And then APA, like Elaine said, just then decided very quickly to adapt to 450.
Well, they had to.
And since the PPR program was actually still in effect, because we had completed, like you were saying before, for the 120 hours, the first 7 classes were completed relatively quickly. We did probably, I think it was 5 or 6 times per year that we met, and I believe we got 16 CEs in each of our meetings. So then, and in fact, we had a graduation with the 120 hours, and then immediately afterwards, the 300-hour requirement was passed by APA. So Sam started to deliver more classes and called them the updates, which initially occurred several times per year to get us from the 120 to 300 relatively quickly. But then after a while, especially when the program went from 300 to 450, those remaining hours were just done through annual quote unquote updates. And it's interesting to think about some of the locations where we met, because the at least for the first 7 classes, and also for some of the initial ones to go from 120 to 300, they met on both coasts. So we would have a meeting alternating in New York City and in Los Angeles at the one of the hotels at the airport. But the hotel in New York City was the Marriott right next to the World Trade
Twin
Center,
Towers,
which went down, with the destruction of the Twin Towers.
But going back to the sequencing of the increase in number of hours, what Sam then did was he started issuing additional certificates, so that with the 120, we got the FPPR, Fellow of the Prescribing Psychologist Register. And for many years, I continued that with my signature box. As it got to be the increased number of hours, then he added additional initials that I've long since forgotten, that for a little while I kept them with my name.
So actually, that was when he developed the parent organization, sort of, for PPR, and called it the International College of Professional Psychology. Right. So then when we got our second diplomate certification, it was the ICPP one that he called in psychopharmacology. And that still probably is the first, and so far the only, although ABIP, of course, is implementing their own board certification in this field, but it will be called something different than psychopharmacology. It will be called psychopharmacological psychology. So as of now, for psychologists, the ICPP is still the only board certification in psychopharmacology that our field has had. So Steve, tell us a little bit more about your involvement with Sam, because you really became one of his very close assistants in delivering a lot of the training programs.
Yes, initially I just voluntarily was helping out with all kinds of stuff when presentations were here in California. And then he would have a booth at APA when that was out here. And I'm standing there just helping out. And he turns to me and said, "You have been of so much help to me that I really should be paying you." So I actually became a paid assistant. And I think I should acknowledge that, both to Sam's credit, because I would have kept on helping out, but I'm going to give him credit for that. And also, in case anybody thinks any of my thought processes are affected by the fact that there was a financial arrangement between us at some point in time, not initially, but after a while. And then he would, when the presentation was in California, he would send me the materials to get copied. If he wasn't able to arrange to have them copied, I would go pick them up and deliver them to whichever hotel we were conducting the workshops at. Did you all attend the one in Las Vegas?
Of course.
Yeah, that was at the Bellagio, so that was kind of nice. And I have attended other educational things in Las Vegas. When California put in a requirement that we have some additional training in sex education, I got that in Las Vegas with Masters and Johnson, which I thought was always an intriguing concept. They were not yet Masters and Johnson, they were just Masters and Johnson. Later they did this, and then they did that. But I thought that was fascinating to get that kind of training in Vegas.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So PPR then, I guess the life cycle of PPR probably was about 10 years, maybe a little bit more, starting around 95 or so. And then I think we completed the 450 hours, the final version of that we completed in 2004. And then he kept up with the annual updates for a little bit longer, maybe just a little bit more into the 2000s. But then the program ceased, and unfortunately, Dr. Feldman passed away in my recollection is around 2015, I think it was.
Approximately an auto accident in North Carolina, I
Right.
believe.
Yeah.
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 So let's reflect a little bit on PPR and its role in our field. Some of the things it did well, maybe some of the missed opportunities. Let's spend a few minutes talking about that.
Well, I'd like to make a statement, see if you all agree. You may have a different perspective. And then I'm very curious to hear more specifically, Elaine, how your connection with Sam led to the program in New Mexico being the first group. But it's always been my perspective that the movement starting in Hawaii with Pat DeLeon and Senator Inouye, it's not going anywhere for an entire decade until Sam started his program and the enthusiasm that the rest of psychology saw. And I think without Sam's efforts and initial success, that this movement, I don't know that it ever would have got going.
In between was the Department of Defense
Yeah,
project, I believe started in 91. So what happened was I think Sam really took advantage of an opportunity and the interest among psychologists growing exponentially. I think you're right that initially Hawaii was a bit of a blip on a radar because it didn't go far, and immediately afterwards not much else happened. But Patrick DeLeon was actually extensively involved in creating the Department of Defense
that's
program.
right.
It started in 1991, and then actually graduated 2 cohorts before that program was essentially killed by psychiatry. But because of the DoD success And once again, and now very concretely, showing that psychologists can, in fact, be trained to become competent psychiatric prescribers of psychiatric medications. That created the need for a program like the DoD um, to be implemented outside of the military. And really, this is where Sam had his vision, to be able to meet that need. Like you said, he was part businessman, but part really had a strong vision with regard to this, and just took an opportunity of the fact that the interest in this was growing. You know, Steve, you mentioned a little bit about Sam choosing not to go into an alliance with another entity. The impetus for some of that came from New Mexico, right? Because when you and Mario, Elaine, started to work with legislation to enact prescriptive authority in New Mexico, I remember that the training itself did not have to be university-based, meaning that it didn't necessarily have to grant college credits, but it had to be allied with the university. That was actually in the regulations.
Well,
Tell us a little bit more about that.
okay. So this is where I can pick up on that. Starting, I got really interested in this because of PPR and was following it with the APA. So I went to NMPA, New Mexico Psych Association, and asked if I could set up a task force for prescriptive authority. And I kept getting shot down. And then finally, I don't know if it was the fourth or fifth time, I went to a meeting and said, I'd really like to set up a task force for prescriptive authority. And someone said, Elaine, why don't you let's let her do it. She keeps coming every 6 months and asking us to do this. So I set up a task force, and I had about 4 or 5 people from NMPA that were interested. And we decided on 2 things right away that were very critical. One was to find out what the interest was in New Mexico, how many people were supportive. And we did that. I wrote a letter, and that was, snail mail time, put a postcard in it that was stamped and said, are you interested? Would you support legislation? Would you consider training? I got a surprising response because all they had to do was just check and put their names. So I had this stack of cards. Turned out to be one of the first miracles, milagros, really. And then the other thing, someone on the committee said, New Mexico legislature will never go for this if we don't have a program here in New Mexico. We have to have our own program in the state. And that was a very wise statement. So then I tried to think of how I could do this. And I actually established an arm of the Center Through the Looking Glass. It was called the Southwestern Institute for the Advancement of Psychotherapy. I ran the whole program through this little institute that was really just me. And I talked to Sam about what I wanted to do. And here's another thank you, Sam. He was extremely gracious to me. And he said, Elaine, if you really want to pursue that, I will let you use the first 6 courses, and I'll send you the material and the tests. You're going to have to set everything else up, and you can give them a PPR designation. So this is sort of how I started, but at the same time, APA was coming up with the 300 hours, right? And I had these 6 courses that Sam graciously shared with me, and I started getting a little bit more sure-footed. And we had a nursing program at New Mexico State University that was training nurses to prescribe, nurse practitioners. And because I'd been an academic, I knew them. I'd served on some of their committees. I went to them and asked them, could you help me develop a program? And we basically took the initial SAM program and what they did to train the nurse practitioners to create this program of 400 hours. I wasn't really yet associated with the university, but I went to the dean of the School of Education. I had been in a counseling, APA accredited counseling psych program there. And I said, is there any way you could sponsor this or, take this on? He was very far-minded, very liberal. He said, well, Elaine, we have this professional development program that we use for our teachers that they can book their continuing education hours and it'll appear on their transcripts. Can you use that? And I said, let's do it. So we developed this whole program, and I worked with somebody in the counseling and ed psych department, and we developed this 400 professional development credit program, which showed up in the graduate catalog at the back as professional development. I don't know what it was, PDV or something, credits. But I didn't have a classroom, But fortunately, my husband was teaching at the community college. He was teaching a program in facilities maintenance, if you can imagine. So I was able to use his facility, which had a classroom in the corner, but was basically, a shop. It was a shop, So that's where we met for the courses. And people still tease me about it sometimes because the flies were going crazy in and out of this classroom. But we had a classroom on the campus, and I ran the whole thing through my little SIAP, Southwestern Institute. I collected, the money that it would take for the credits to show up on the university and the money I needed to pay the faculty, and started doing it. I think the first iteration was just about, I don't know, maybe it started about 10 people, 12. And it was good because we were following, some of that coursework. I had Sam's coursework. I called, those wonderful teachers to come in, and they came in.
So you had some of the same faculty that he...
Oh, yeah. John Preston was here a lot. He was wonderful. They were top notch. And then I found out, through the nursing department, some other people. But, the 80-hour practicum that's been required, that came about because I had connected with the nursing department. And that's what they did with their nurses. They had an 80-hour practicum. So that's how that evolved. When I went forward in the legislature the first time, that's what we had, is the professional development program. And it was amazing. I had so much support. There were all these miracles that just seemed, I just can't even believe some of them happened. When we got all the way up to the legislature and it looked like something that was going to happen, the dean of the College of Education came up with me. And the head of the nursing department came up with me, and they testified that the nurses testified that we were going through the same coursework they went through, and that we were competent at the same level that they were. Here's kind of a funny thing. So the psychiatrists from the University of New Mexico we kind of caught them with their pants down. I mean, they had even though we had said we were going to do this, I don't think they thought we were going to get any traction. So there we are, and they're just like beside themselves, upset, and saying things like New Mexico State University could never pull off a program to teach people this. Well, Mario and I sat there and watched all the legislators from the southern part of the state get infuriated that their university was being attacked. It became an NMSU, UNM kind of thing. And in the end, there was only one Republican legislator from the southern part of the state that was the only legislator that didn't vote for this bill. It was quite fascinating. If I could back up a little bit too, speaking of an even earlier miracle, I met Mario through PPR. I had not known him, and he came up to me at one of the meetings and said, "Hey, Elaine, I see you're from New Mexico, and I'm from New Mexico, and we just visited." And actually, I had started the program, and I was contacting him, and he was like, "Oh, I don't want to do this. I don't want to get in the legislature again. I've done that, been there." And I said, "Come down to the courses. You're going to be surprised how good they are." And of course, once he did, he got hooked. That was amazing because Mario was really respected by the Hispanic legislators. You know, he was a little psychologist from Las Vegas, New Mexico, who made good, got a PhD. They were very proud of him. And so between New Mexico State and Mario's, strengths, and then I brought in some of my own because I had been one of the few psychologists in the southern part of the state. So by the time we went to the legislature, I had all the district attorneys behind us because I'd worked with the district attorney in Las Cruces, and she'd gotten me in contact with their state organization, and they supported us, and they were all over the legislature in every every meeting saying, we support these psychologists. They're going to be able to help us get people that are in the prisons that we can't get them tested. We can't bring them to trial. So that was very powerful. And then we had a hidden gun. Did you know about that?
I'm not sure.
Well, Mario's wife, Diana Marquez, was the right-hand person for the Attorney General. And she's adorable and very feisty. And so she was all over the legislature, and they loved her too. And when she took on some of these legislators personally and said, "You're not going to vote against this bill, are you?" It really was quite powerful. So it was just amazing the things that happened. Another amazing thing, here we are with the psychiatrists going crazy. The president of the university at that time was a psychologist, and he had his personal lobbyist that came out and said, we had not even met with him. The lobbyist came and said, the president of UNM supports this bill. Well, that was amazing. The legislators are sitting there saying, okay, the School of Medicine doesn't support it, but your president supports it. What? It was almost comical, And then we had all this support from the legislators that were serving the Native Americans because they weren't getting any help. And they stood up and said, well, I'll take one of those prescribing psychologists. We don't have anybody. So we got all the way through both houses, past the floor of the House, and we're on the floor of the Senate the first year we tried this because of all these miracles with this certificate program. That's what it was, the professional development credit.
Right.
And the only reason it didn't pass, because we had the votes on the Senate floor, was that the Senate pro tem wouldn't let it come up for a vote. It just never came up for a vote. So that was the beginning of all this. And it was actually many years later that we were able to turn it into, first of all, a degree out of the College of Education, which was an MA. And I looked it up. It really didn't become a clinical psychopharmacology MS until 2019. The first iteration that graduated with a Master's of Art was an iteration of students from the Netherlands in 2010.
Great history, and it's wonderful to hear some of these backstories about how this all came about. One of the debates in our field, psychopharmacology, that existed back then, I think it, to some degree, there's a few people that still kind of continuing that now, but for the most part, it's been, I think, resolved. But certainly 20 years ago, there was a very active debate between the two different training philosophies. The philosophy that PPR in your program followed, which is the certificate model, versus the MSCP route, right? So as we all know, the MSCP now is the standard that the states use to become credentialed, to become a prescribing psychologist. But that wasn't yet the case back then. And New Mexico didn't require the master's degree initially. So I'm curious what both of your thoughts are about this conflict in the field. When I spoke with Dr. Glenn Alley about Louisiana and prescribing privileges came to be in Louisiana, PPR's program, of course, was already in effect when they were doing this in Louisiana, and New Mexico had just passed. But the rules were not implemented yet. So they're doing this in Louisiana. Of course, they also took them several tries, but they succeeded. But when they talked about the training, one of their legislators was supposedly have said, well, if you guys do certificate programs, we know how that works. You're going to go to some resort, you're going to play some golf, you're going to phone it in. And what kind of training is that? Is that really a way to obtain medical training? Which is why Louisiana and psychologists who wanted to pass prescriptive authority in Louisiana approached CSPP, the California School of Professional Psychology, to develop the first MSCP program in the country, which started in 1998. And the first two graduating classes were all people from Louisiana, who then became prescribing psychologists in Louisiana. So that's the nature of the kind of conflict in the field, between certificate training and is that sufficient versus the MSCP. I'm curious about
remember Louisiana, they are medical psychologists, not prescribing psychologists.
They weren't yet. They had become that later. Well, there were medical psychologists, but they weren't out of the medical board yet. They moved under the medical board a few years later. But that's
the advanced practice medical psychologists have to be under the medical board. But yes, their original title was medical psychologist.
Right.
Which did not make rehab psychologists happy, didn't make neuropsychologists happy.
No.
And they're still using that field today. They're the only state that uses the field medical psychologists instead of prescribing psychologists.
Mm-hmm. So I recall Russ Newman, who was head of the practice directorate at the time, saying that when the APA came up with the regulations, they or the criteria, they specifically didn't want to put in a master's degree because they didn't know which way it was going to go. They wanted to leave it as open as possible. And they were aware, as a lot of people are, that certificate programs are very common in Europe. They're not so common here, but they're very credible all over Europe, post-degree. I can tell you, looking back on it, I don't think we would have ever had a law if it had required a master's at the beginning, because there's no way I could have sold New Mexico State University to start a master's degree. It's not a private university, it's a state university. I started to say, okay, the steps you have to go through all the way up through higher education to get any changes in a university program. It's probably harder than passing the law, So I would have been at that probably for 10 years, just trying to get that done. So I'm grateful. Let me say that. I think it's great that I surely don't have any issues with it being, a graduate degree now, because there's more control over it. But I'm very grateful that there was, when we began, this more flexible opportunity.
So it really had important practical implications that it could be a certificate program.
Yes. Oh, I can't imagine how I could have accomplished it. I just couldn't. I couldn't have gotten a program in New Mexico. I could have tried to link it to PPR, but I don't. I told you, how powerful it was that it was associated with New Mexico State University. So I don't think it would have gone any other way. It was another one of I feel like I was just sort of, I didn't actually know what I was doing. And I don't know whose hand was in this guiding me, that so many wonderful things like that fell in place,
And that's really the thing about being a pioneer. You don't have an example you can follow, right? You're really forging the road ahead the best you can based on what you have available to you. And of course, you and Mario and, your significant role, especially in the training, really forged the way, not only for New Mexico, but then, of course, it's kind of opened the door gradually for other states to implement that as well.
So, we got the law through the next year, which was really remarkable too, because New Mexico really has, you're only supposed to theoretically only introduces new bills every other year. And the alternate year is just supposed to be for financial issues. The only way to introduce a new bill is if it gets called up by the governor as a special message. So when I came home, driving back down from Santa Fe to Las Cruces, after we got treated so poorly by the Senate Pro Tem the first time, I swore I'd never do it again. I was so discouraged. But in about 2 months, that faded and I got feisty. And I thought, okay, we got to get a special message from the governor somehow. I didn't know how to do that. But meantime, you want to hear another amazing thing that happened. I got this call from this doctor in Santa Fe, Don Feinberg, and he wanted to refer somebody to me. And we got into a nice talk. He asked me more. He'd heard that about me and blah, blah, blah. We got into this nice talk, and he wanted to know what I was up to. So I told him about this. And he said, well, that's very interesting. I think that's a really good idea. And he sent this person to me. And a few months later, I was meeting with our students in the program, and I find out from them that he's a psychiatrist in Santa Fe. I just assumed I was getting a referral from a colleague, a psychologist. And he said he was supportive on the phone. And it was like, oh my God, I can't believe this. So then I got a hold of him, and he was so helpful. So we managed to get on the governor's docket, Governor Johnson. He was a hippie governor, literally. And he had made time where any citizen, if you were lucky, if you got there and you got your name on a list, you could meet with him. So Don Feinberg and I met with Governor Johnson before the second year. Don Feinberg was going on about why he thought it was a good idea. And Governor Johnson looked at him and said, "And who are you?" And he said, "I'm a psychiatrist in Santa Fe." And he's very distinguished looking. So that didn't hurt anything. And then I had been studying about Johnson and what he cared about. And so I knew he was really concerned about all the people that were in the prisons that, like I mentioned earlier, that we were just stuck there, they had mental illness and no one was treating them. So I said to him, "Governor Johnson, do you understand about this bill? You understand the problems of all the prisoners that that are stuck in the jails. And I just don't know when we're going to get another broad-minded governor like you. You have to call up the bill." And the smile cracked, across his face from one ear to the other. And he did. And it was ugly the second year because they were more prepared for us. But we did. We made it. We got it through that second year.
And it's such an important legislative lesson in what you just said, which is to understand the issues that your legislators care about, and to be able to show how what you want to do is going to help meet the needs that they really care about, that are special to them. You guys in New Mexico, and as well as the folks in Louisiana, were so successful at doing that, which is, I think, is part of
One
why.
of the things that I also maybe kind of blundered into, I can get back to these postcards. So I have these postcards, right? And I use them, of course. Well, I invited anybody to come into the program. But once we started the legislative efforts, I went through those postcards and I knew which psychologists were supportive of the bill all around the state. I and the people that were working with me, we connected to those people. And I developed all the material that APA was trying, to help us develop. And I sent them folders. And I said, "Before we go to the legislature, will you please meet with your people in your home territory before the legislature even meets?" Because our lobbyist had told us that you want to use what he called the inoculation technique. You want to get to them before the opponents get to them. And so, that's what we did. We sent them all over and got them doing that. And those legislators weren't going to be turned around by the very angry psychiatrists, because they'd already heard those arguments. So I passed that information on to Louisiana. And that's when they established LAMP, because that had helped us so much. And so then they started getting those lists of people from all around the state and legislators. And that was the final push that they needed that got it through. And I don't know that that's critical in every state, but I know that made a big difference in New Mexico.
Yeah, that's never been the approach in California, unfortunately. The people who have been in charge of the movement here in no way have ever worked to organize at a local level. The only thing they ever wanted from the local level was fundraising so that the money would go to Sacramento for them to control it at the state level. And
Maybe
that's
it's
another
never
whole
been a
story.
big state. I don't know, Steve. I mean, I know Beth Romreimer went all over Illinois. She really did do the grassroots efforts. And like I said, I'm not sure if it's necessary. I just know in a small state like New Mexico, it was a wise move. It made a big difference.
Well, California is very long. We think of San Francisco as Northern California. If you look at a map, San Francisco is barely above the midpoint of California. There's almost nothing north of San Francisco.
Yeah, different
Eureka,
states.
Eureka, California.
Which almost became its own state. My understanding is some
Right,
time
right.
ago, right? There's some history there. So as we kind of close out our discussion, I wonder what your thoughts and reflections are about the RxP movement, but more specifically, RxP education since the days of PPR and your programming.
I've always been impressed with the importance of adding this component to our education and our skill base. And it doesn't matter to me what percentage of clinical psychologists would be doing prescribing. It's an entirely separate issue. Do we care what percentage are doing Rorschachs? But it's basic to our profession.
To understand the benefits.
Patients,
Yeah.
patients deserve us to have this knowledge base. And so I always took away this little piece of knowledge, just little tiny piece. I know through this program why urologists are actually nephrologists. Because kidneys are full of nephrons.
But you mentioned something really interesting because that is really such a major part of what APA has tried to do, at least in the last 10 years now, which is to promote the importance, to promote the education at various levels, right? So we need to promote the education about psychopharmacology at the most basic level, drugs and behavior type courses for undergraduate students. And we need to increase our visibility so that undergraduate students at least know that if you want to become a psychologist, there are several paths that you can pursue. There are several specialties, of which psychopharmacology is one, right? So that's the first level. The second level is undergraduate level, taking at least a course, more detailed and in-depth course in psychopharmacology as part of doctoral studies in psychology, so that you have some knowledge about these as you develop, your skills to be a practicing psychologist, right? And then the final step is for those psychologists who want to go the next step and become prescribing psychologists, and that's where the MSCP now would come in because has become the standard in our field. What are your thoughts, Elaine, about how you've seen New Mexico kind of evolve
I'm
over the
so
years?
proud of my colleagues that have come after me that have moved the law forward. That includes you very much.
Thank you.
Move it forward in just amazing direction, where we really are going to be able to have all the skills we need. So I think that's just wonderful. And I'm so grateful we'll be able to supervise our own, because I was just talking to the training director of our New Mexico program, and he was telling me so many of the students just still drop out after the academic coursework. They cannot get a medical supervisor. And I have heard that even the nurses are having trouble getting supervisors because these big hospital corps do not want their physicians doing it. So I think that's wonderful. My biggest concern is that we not capitulate to the money and forget we're psychologists. Start just seeing people for very short times. I don't care what your training is, from my perspective. I don't think you can understand somebody in 10 minutes, And so I know that, that was the hope of the APA, and that, let's be psychologists first. I think the program can start pre-doctorally, but I do think it's important that we make sure that we continue to be psychologists in terms of our interviewing techniques and assessment skills, but also being there for the person. I just don't see how you can. I once wrote an article about, the pill serving as a transference object, that they're just something in between the therapist and the patient that can help you, the placebo and more. And if you separate it from being a good therapist, you take a lot of the potency out of it.
And that's such an important point. And I think it is true of the vast majority of prescribing psychologists that they continue to be psychologists, that they continue to utilize psychological techniques. Now they add psychopharmacology and the ability to write prescriptions for patients who can potentially benefit from that. And there are a few research findings that I find really encouraging. Research by McGrath and colleagues a little bit longer, and more recently by Hughes and colleagues, has shown that the majority of prescribing psychologists continue to utilize therapy as part of their sessions with their patients, and that their sessions tend to be longer in duration than the sessions for psychiatrists. And of course, another piece of this too is that prescribing psychologists tend to be more judicial and selective about the use of medications and how many simultaneous psychotropics they will utilize, right? So psychologists are far more likely to deprescribe medications if the regimen is too excessive than, for example, psychiatrists. So I think these are very encouraging findings that speak to exactly, Elaine, what you were talking about, which is we need to retain our identity as psychologists.
Yeah. I think you're right, and I'm hopeful about it, but I also know that there's tremendous pressure being put upon us at institutions to shorten our time and see more people. So it's worrisome to me, but there are really positive signs at the same time.
Yeah, there are some competing forces.
Yes.
There, I agree with you. Yeah. And I think cycling back to the education piece, I think it's important for us as a field to recognize that even though it wasn't the initial path towards obtaining psychopharmacology training, the MSCP now is the standard in our field. And I think we need to strengthen it, and we need to continue to revise it so that it is as good a degree as it can be and meets the needs of our patients as the developments and medications, but also in psychotherapies, progress. But the bottom line is, this is how now you become a prescribing psychologist. You obtain the MSCP. Well, thank you both for joining me. This was a most fascinating conversation, and once again, reviewing aspects of our training which are very close to my heart.
Thank you for setting it up, and thank Alliant for supporting it. It was really nice when you asked me to do this and I started reviewing all this. So I'm glad I got a chance to share it.
Thank you, Elaine. And thank you, Steve. It was great to reminisce with you as well about a lot of the PPR details.
Yeah, we just should have gone to Vegas and taped this.
Uh-huh.
It's called Revisiting the Scene of the Crime, right?
And thanks, everyone, for joining us. And please come back and see us again on another episode of the continuing evolution and history of RxP. Everyone have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.